Welcome to BeFM Drama, where we turn great literature into gripping radio. I'm your host, Joshua Cornwell, and today we're bringing you part 2 in our 5-part adaptation of The Man with the Twisted Lip, a classic Sherlock Holmes mystery from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. In part 2 of our story, Watson is shocked to find his friend Holmes lying in wait in a disreputable opium den on the banks of the Thames, seeking information on a case. Watson, who only ever entered the den to find an addicted old school friend and return him to his worried wife, now finds himself getting caught up on the case that has led his friend to lurk in such an evil place. We walked quietly beside each other for a moment, and I thought over his words. Who could it be that my friend had set himself against in that vile, smoke-filled den? An enemy?
Yes, one of my natural enemies, or shall I say, my natural prey. Briefly, Watson, I'm in the middle of a very remarkable investigation, and I have hoped to find a clue in the incoherent ramblings of these addicts, as I have done before. Had I been recognized in that den, my life would have been forfeit, for I have used it before for my own purposes, and the rascally manager has sworn to have vengeance upon me. There's a trapdoor at the back of that building near the corner of Paul's Wharf, which could tell some strange tales of what has passed through it upon the moonless nights.
What? You do not mean bodies?
Aye, Watson, bodies. We would be rich men if we had £1,000 for every poor devil who has been done to death in that den. It is the vilest murder trap on the whole riverside, and I fear that Neville St. Clair has entered it never to leave again. But our cot should be here.
He put his 2 forefingers between his teeth and whistled shrilly, a signal which was answered by a similar whistle from the distance, followed shortly by the rattle of wheels and the clink of horses' hooves. A tall dog cart dashed up through the gloom, throwing out 2 golden tunnels of yellow light from its side lanterns.
Now, Watson, you'll come with me, won't you?
If I can be of use.
Oh, a trusty comrade is always of use, and a chronicler still more so. My room at the Cedars is a double-bedded one.
The Cedars?
Yes, that is Mr. St. Clair's house. I am staying there while I conduct the inquiry.
Where is it then?
Near Lee in Kent. We have a 7-mile drive before us.
But I am all in the dark.
Of course you are. You'll know all about it presently. Jump up here. All right, John, we shall not need you. Here's half a crown. Look out for me tomorrow, about 11. So long, then.
The driver stepped off the cart. Holmes took his place and flicked the horse with his whip, and we dashed away through the endless succession of somber and deserted streets, which widened gradually until we were flying across a broad bridge with the murky river flowing sluggishly beneath us. A dull fog was drifting slowly across the sky, and a star or 2 twinkled dimly here and there through the rifts of the clouds. Holmes drove in silence, with his head sunk upon his breast and the air of a man who is lost in thought, while I sat beside him, curious to learn what this new quest might be, which seemed to tax his powers so sorely, and yet afraid to break in upon the current of his thoughts. We had driven several miles, and were beginning to get to the fringe of the belt of suburban villas, when he shook himself, shrugged his shoulders, and lit up his pipe with the air of a man who has satisfied himself that he is acting for the best.
You have a grand gift of silence, Watson. It makes you quite invaluable as a companion. Upon my word, it is a great thing for me to have someone to talk to, for my own thoughts are not over-pleasant. I was wondering what I should say to this dear woman tonight when she meets me at the door.
You forget that I know nothing about it.
I shall just have time to tell you the facts of the case before we get to Lee. It seems absurdly simple, and yet somehow I can get nothing to go upon. There's plenty of thread, no doubt, but I can't get the end of it in my hand. Now, I'll state the case clearly and concisely to you, Watson, and maybe you can see a spark where all is dark to me.
Proceed, then. The story Holmes had to tell me began thusly. Some years ago, there came to Lee a gentleman named Neville St. Clair, who appeared to have plenty of money. He took a large villa, laid out the grounds very nicely, and lived in good style. By degrees, he made friends in the neighborhood, and in 1887 he married the daughter of a local brewer, with whom he had 2 children. He had no occupation, but was interested in several companies and went into town as a rule in the morning, returning by the 5:14 from Cannon Street every night. Mr. St. Clair was now 37 years of age, a man of temperate habits, a good husband, a very affectionate father, and a man who was popular with all who knew him. His whole debts, as far as Holmes had been able to ascertain, amounted to £88 and 10 shillings, while he had £220 standing to his credit in the Capital and Counties Bank. There was no reason, therefore, to think that money troubles had been weighing heavily on his mind. The previous Monday, Neville St. Clair had gone into town earlier than usual, saying before he started that he had 2 important commissions to perform, and that he would bring his little boy home a box of toy bricks. Now, by the merest chance, his wife received a telegram upon that same Monday, very shortly after her husband's departure, to the effect that a small parcel she had been expecting was waiting for her at the offices of the Aberdeen Shipping Company. Now, if you know London, you will know that the office of the company is in Fresno Street, which branches out of Upper Swandam Lane, where I had found Holmes in the den. Mrs. St. Clair had her lunch, started for the city, did some shopping, made her way to the company's office, got her packet, and found herself at exactly 4:35, walking through Swandam Lane on her way back to the station. The day was an exceedingly hot one, and Mrs. St. Clair walked slowly, glancing about in the hope of seeing a cab, as she did not like the neighborhood in which she found herself. While she was walking this way down Swandam Lane, she suddenly heard a cry, and was struck cold to see her husband looking down at her and, as it seemed to her, beckoning to her from a second-floor window. The window was open, and she distinctly saw his face, which she described as being terribly agitated. He waved his hands frantically to her, and then vanished from the window so suddenly that it seemed to her that he had been plucked back by some irresistible force from behind. One singular point which struck her eyes was that, although he wore the same dark coat he had started to town in, he had on neither collar nor necktie. Convinced that something was amiss, she rushed down the steps, for the house was none other than the opium den in which I had found Holmes at night, and, running through the front door, she attempted to climb the stairs which led to the first floor. At the foot of the stairs, however, she met the scoundrelly manager, who pushed her back out into the street. Filled with maddening doubts and fears, she rushed down the lane, and by rare good fortune, met in Fresno Street a number of constables with an inspector. The inspector and 2 men accompanied her back, and, in spite of the continued resistance of the proprietor, they made their way to the room in which Mr. St. Clair had been last seen. There was no sign of him there. In fact, on the whole of that floor, there was no one to be found except a wretch of hideous appearance, who, it seemed, made his home there. Both he and the manager swore that no one else had been in the front room during the afternoon. So determined was their denial that the inspector was made uncertain, and had almost come to believe that Mrs. St. Clair had been deluded, when, with a cry, she sprang at a small box which lay upon the table and tore the lid from it. Out fell a cascade of children's bricks, the toys which her husband had promised to bring home to their boy. This discovery, and the evident confusion which the man showed, made the inspector realize that the matter was serious. The rooms were carefully examined, and the investigation pointed to an abominable crime. The front room was plainly furnished as a sitting room, and led into a small bedroom, which looked out upon the back of one of the wharves. Between the wharf and the bedroom window is a narrow strip, which is dry at low tide, but is covered at high tide with at least 4.5 feet of water. The bedroom window was broad and open from below. On examination, traces of blood were seen upon the windowsill, and several scattered drops were visible upon the wooden floor of the bedroom. And, hidden away behind a curtain in the front room, were all the clothes of Mr. Neville St. Clair, with the exception of his coat. His boots, his socks, his hat, and his watch, all were there. There were no signs of violence upon any of these garments, and there were no other traces of Mr. Neville St. Clair. Out of the window he must apparently have gone, for no other exit could be discovered, and the ominous bloodstains upon the sill gave little promise that he could save himself by swimming, for the tide was at its very highest at the moment of the tragedy. And now, as to the villains who seemed to be immediately implicated in this matter. The manager was known to be a man of the vilest history, but as, By Mrs. St. Clair's story, he was at the foot of the stairs within a few seconds of her husband's appearance at the window. He could hardly have been more than an accessory to the crime. His defense was one of absolute ignorance, and he protested that he had no knowledge as to the doings of Hugh Boone, his lodger, and that he could not account in any way for the presence of the missing gentleman's clothes. So much for the manager. But now for the sinister man who lived upon the second floor of the opium den, and who was certainly the last human being whose eyes rested upon Neville St. Clair. His name was Hugh Boone. Why on earth was Mr. Neville St. Clair, the wealthy, kindly father and husband, seen waving in distress from the upper window of an opium den in a squalid London riverside neighborhood? And what could possibly have become of him? And what might this crippled man, this Hugh Boone, have had to do with his seemingly inexplicable disappearance? Join us again tomorrow as we begin to answer these questions and more in Part 3 of The Man with the Twisted Lip here on BeFM Drama.